Hello, my name is Kathy, and I am an occupational therapist working for the Specialist Children and Young People Services in Newham. In this training, we are going to talk about sensory processing and regulation. This training is to help you to understand sensory processing and its impact on a child's ability to engage with activities and to manage their emotions. The training will be divided into two sections. The first section will include a brief overview of our sensory system, an understanding of sensory processing, and how everyone has different sensory preferences. For example, sensory seeking behaviours, sensory avoiding behaviours, and poor registration. The second section will explore what regulation means, how the levels of energy impact regulation, and how we, as adults, can prepare activities and the environment to help children regulate and support their sensory preferences. After this training, there will be a short quiz to review what you have learned. Before we start our training, if you have not watched the Living in a Sensory World series, please pause this training video before continuing. This video series will help you to understand the body's sensory systems so that you have the foundational knowledge needed to fully immerse yourself in this training. Please scan the QR code now to access the Living in a Sensory World series. We hope that you have watched and enjoyed the 6 Living in a Sensory World videos and have a better understanding of the 8 senses, our different sensory preferences, and how they affect our everyday life. It is essential that all senses work together to help us understand the world. It is important to understand sensory processing as it helps us learn how it impacts on our daily functioning. Sensory processing starts with taking information in through our 8 senses. Our brain then organizes, interprets, and makes sense of the sensory information. The brain does this by filtering out what is not necessary and focusing on what is important in that given time. This means the person will use the information to perform the task successfully. This is called selective attention. Selective attention helps us to ignore distractions and instead respond to the most important information when completing a task. Taking our tactile sense, for example, if a spider was crawling on your arm, how would you react? You might shoo the spider away. You might scream, or run, or freeze on the spot. You may not even notice the spider at first. How do you react to the feeling of different fabric? It might not bother you at all. You might not like the feel of certain fabrics or new clothes. They may feel scratchy. Most people's behavioural response may be pretty typical. But for some children and young people, they do not always respond in a typical way. So learning about sensory preferences is really important for us to be able to support the children that we work with. We all have unique sensory preferences that influence how we interact with the world. Consider how you respond to different sensory experiences. Do you seek or avoid fast-paced activities like roller coasters? Do you enjoy the hustle and bustle of busy places like shopping centres or parties? Or do you prefer quiet activities like crafting or spending time in nature? After a long day, do you relax by changing into comfy clothes and unwinding on the sofa? Or do you prefer going for a run or attending a workout class? Do you relax by socialising with friends over a coffee or a meal? Think about whether you fidget unconsciously, biting a pencil or playing with your hair when you're trying to focus. Like now, for example, What are you doing to help you to focus on this presentation? These are all examples of sensory preferences. Sensory preferences are unique to each one of us and help us manage stress to feel calm. These preferences can change over time and should not always be considered as negative. They add meaning to our everyday experiences. What are your sensory preferences? If you're in a group, you may pause the video and discuss this with others. Each person's level of acceptance and tolerance to sensory stimulation is different. We're going to use the analogy of a cup to help clarify this a bit more. I want you to imagine that you have an invisible cup for each sensory system inside you, and this represents your capacity to handle sensory stimuli. The water in the cup symbolizes the sensory input you experience throughout the day, like sounds, bright lights, textures, and movement, and all of the things we have been talking about in the previous slides and videos. Some people are born with a larger cup. Their cup can hold a lot of water before it overflows. In sensory preference terms, this means that they can tolerate more sensory input without becoming overwhelmed. For these individuals, loud noises, bright lights, or busy environments might not bother them much because their cups have plenty of room to fill up before they reach their limit. Their cups have more capacity and they have a higher tolerance for sensory input. Some people may even seek out sensory experiences to fill up their cup in order to meet their sensory needs. On the other hand, some people have a smaller cup, which means they have a lower tolerance. Their cup fills up more quickly with sensory input, and it doesn't take much for their cup to overflow. For example, even a little bit of noise, a bright light, or a crowded space can cause them to feel overwhelmed, anxious, or dysregulated quickly. As a result, they might avoid activities that expose them to overwhelming sensory input. Another group of people might not even be aware or notice that they have a cup. This means that they are not aware of what their body needs and therefore act passively or as inattentive and in their own world. For example, some people might not realize that they have hurt themselves, or they are hungry, or that they need to go to the toilet because they are not noticing their sensory needs. This is known as having poor registration to sensory input. It is important to be aware of these differences in how a person responds to sensory information and their tolerance level. Just because one person's cup has plenty of room doesn't mean that someone else's does. It is an individual thing to each person. You may also notice that your tolerance levels are not always the same and can change. You know that saying, "I got out of the wrong side of my bed this morning"? Some days, things just don't feel right, and you are not sure why. This is because people's cups are not always the same from day to day. Their tolerance can change depending on the situation and how they feel physically or emotionally. It also depends on how energetic they feel and their well-being on that day. For those with smaller cups, it's crucial to manage their environment and sensory input carefully to prevent their cup from overflowing. Now think about some of the children you work with and what their sensory preferences may be. Consider, do they have a large cup or a small cup? And remember back to our Living in a Sensory World series. All of our sensory systems operate differently. For example, some children may have strong sensory likes and dislikes towards certain sensory input. When we talk about sensory seeking, we often use terms like on the move a lot or finds it hard to stay still. The pictures in the slide are some of the things that you might see in your schools. You may see some children who love to move, who love to bounce, love rocking back and forth on a chair, tiptoe walk in the playground, or spin for long periods without becoming dizzy. Some children may enjoy different textures, like messy play, walking barefoot, or playing with fidget toys. Some children instead may prefer different visual environments, like being in a dark room, or bright lights and bright colours. What do we mean when we say sensory avoiding? We all have things that we don't like or find hard to cope with, and this may change from day to day. Most of us will have ways to cope with these feelings, but you may see some more extreme behaviours in some of the children that you work with. You may see some children who avoid loud noises by covering their ears, or children who dislike being in crowded environments. You may notice that they drop on the floor or run away to hide in a corner. Some children might dislike certain textures and not engage in messy play. They may be fussy with food or avoid putting on certain clothing. They may also show sensitivity to touch, smell, or light in the room. Some children might be reluctant to access some playground equipment due to discomfort with fast movement, fear of heights, or a sense of insecurity. What about children who are presenting with poor registration? When we talk about poor registration, we often use the terms passive, inattentive, or in their own world. These children may not know when they are in pain after hurting themselves, or not recognize when their face is dirty, or may not respond to their name being called. They may present as sleepy and lethargic. They may appear to have shut down. These children often get overlooked, and their sensory needs are not met because they are quiet and do not disrupt the class. Children show us their sensory preference through how they behave. When a child presents with sensory seeking behaviour, or sensory avoiding behaviour, or poor registration to sensory input, the child is telling us their sensory preferences on that day. These sensory preferences are unique to them and can change from day to day and over time as they get older. It is important to remember that a child's sensory preferences are not negative or wrong. They can actually help us to understand the child better. At this point, we would strongly advise you to revisit the sensory detective video to learn more about how our sensory preferences and sensory speed bumps can impact a child's behaviour.